Hey everyone, welcome back to Spooky Bricks. So in this video we're going to be looking at my mock of the Lizzie Borden house of Fall River, Massachusetts. Lizzie Borden lived in the house with her father, stepmother, sister, and live-in maid. Then in August of 1892, the maid found the father and stepmother brutally murdered with an axe. And although Lizzie was charged with the murder, she ultimately was acquitted due to lack of any real evidence. However, it is still widely believed today that she was in fact the murderer. The house exists today as a museum and a bed and breakfast for those with a morbid fascination who want to sleep in a murder house. So the first thing I did was to create templates for the walls just to help figure out the overall size. This may just look like a random big chunk of bricks, but it's actually the template for both sides of the house. The bright lime green representing the space for the windows. Using those as a guide, I made the terrain using various dark tan and olive green plates, which create a nice autumn grass color combination. And to add to that autumn feel, I added some leaves to the ground. Yellows up front and some reds in the back. As usual, I used a variety of different pieces to act as the leaves, just because I think that makes it look a little more natural and organic looking. And of course we have our obligatory pumpkin. I gave some texture to the foundation of the house using masonry bricks and 1x1 and 1x2 rounded plates. The basement windows were created with some 2x3 window frames in dark green, which I placed on their side using snot bricks. Then behind those I put the spindled fence pieces to replicate the look of the barred basement windows of the real house. Figuring out what colors to use for the house was a fairly easy task since sand green and dark green matched the actual colors pretty closely. I also considered using olive green for the lighter green, but for one, I wanted it to stand out from the olive green in the grass, and two, pieces in sand green are just a little cheaper and a little more plentiful. So the house has a striped column on each of its corners. These took a little brainstorming to figure out the best way to approach them, but ultimately I decided to build them horizontally with plates creating the stripes down the front and tiles making up the stripes on the sides. And then I attached the whole thing with some snot bricks. I also added a snot brick on one end of the column so it could be attached at the top. The smaller columns in front of the door, as well as the area around the door, is also built on its side in order to get that narrow vertical striping. Alright, so let's talk about jumper plates, or more specifically 1x2 jumper plates, because I used them all over this build in three major ways. The first is just the most common use, and that's to offset things by half a stud. I wanted the columns to stick out a bit from the walls, and doing it an entire stud just seemed like too much. So I used jumper plates to get the columns to stick out on the front half a stud. But in order to get the side walls flush with the columns, I also had to offset the walls half a stud. As you can see here, the bricks in the walls don't line up with the bricks in the foundation. So from the first dark green stripe up, everything is offset, and at the second green stripe it all goes back again. Jumper plates were also used to get the window sills to stick out a bit. And speaking of the windows, that brings us to my second use for jumper plates, and that is for the shutters. Originally, I had planned to build the shutters in the same way that I built them on my Ropes Mansion mock, which was using 6 of the 1x2 grill pieces to mimic that shutter texture. But when I went to source the 1x2 grill pieces in dark green on Bricklink, I quickly realized that they must be a pretty rare piece, since not only were they expensive, but no store even came close to carrying them in the quantities that I would need. So I had to go back to the drawing board a bit, but after some experimentation I found that I could use the bottoms of the jumper plates to get an interesting texture that could work nicely for the shutters. And jumpers in dark green are both plentiful and cheap. And the third use for the jumpers was for texturing. To get the look of the siding, I used the backs of masonry bricks, which create some nice texture lines. But the issue is that they only come in 1x2 bricks, so if you have a space that's only 1 stud wide, you really can't use them. So that's where the jumper plates come in. If you stack a bunch of them up, the grooves on the bottoms create a nice texture that's not too dissimilar from the texture on the masonry bricks. The lines don't line up perfectly, but it's close enough. And a good example of their use is on either side of the door on the shed. The attic windows are built on their side to help them look a little closer to their real-life counterparts. So, like my mock of the Ropes mansion, I completely tiled off the roof. Although on that mock I used exclusively dark bluish gray for the roofing, but I thought maybe that looked a little too plain and uniform, so on this build I sprinkled in some tiles in the old dark gray just to add a little more variety. It also gives the illusion of some weathering. I used jumper plates to attach the leaves to the roof, which I guess would be then the fourth use. The plates with rails are handy to fill in gaps at the peak of the roof and around the chimney. Speaking of, the chimney is made up of bricks in dark red and reddish brown, which give it that perfect brownstone coloring. And I added some texturing using masonry bricks and rounded 1x2 plates. I've had some questions about interiors, and as I'd mentioned before, I don't really normally do interiors since there's no real good way to show them off in a completely closed off building. Also, I use some techniques that, although they look good on the outside, don't necessarily look so good on the inside. And finally, I added some lights. So that is about it for my mock of the Lizzie Borden house. Let me know what you think, and of course stay tuned for more spooky builds.